After the Six-Day War, Israel entered into a situation for about 3 years, which was known as the War of Attrition. And this was a very difficult period where Egypt was continuously attacking Israel along the Suez Canal. Jordan was shelling different areas across the border. It was a very difficult time. In fact, 968 Israelis were killed during this war, and 3,730 Israelis were injured, which is really devastating. And if you just think about the number of families affected by this, it's just really enormous. And during that time, the well-known Moshe Dayan, who was at different times the Minister of Defense, the head of the IDF. He was speaking before a group of graduates of the IDF Command and Staff College. And these were higher level members of the IDF. They were graduating. And he was trying to encourage them because it was a very difficult time where the morale of Israel was being weakened by this war of attrition. And he shared what he had shared with a group of Americans that he had spoken to not long before them. And they had asked him, what's going to be the end? Where are we going with all of this, with this war of attrition? And he shared with them, he quoted, interestingly, a few verses from the Torah, and he wanted to convey this message of inspiration to the graduates. And he said, we know from the Torah that God told Abraham, Al tira Avram. Avram, don't fear. The same words God used to Yitzchak, to Isaac. He said, Al tira, do not fear. And also to Jacob, our forefather, he said, Al tira Avdi Yaakov, that Yaakov, do not fear. So we see that he was conveying to them that we have to be strong. We can't enter into a state of fear. We have to know that we'll be victorious and everything will be fine. And then he concluded with a verse from the book of Joshua, which refers to a great miracle that God performed in the days of Joshua, where God held the sun still. It stopped moving in its cycle. And the verse from the Tanakh is, Shemesh begivain doim v'yarech be'emek Ayalon, that the sun held still in Givain Doim, and the moon held still in the valley of Ayalon. And he basically said, Moshe Dayan was conveying this idea that we cannot live in fear. We can't. We have to approach this courageously. That was his message of inspiration. The Rebbe, without quoting who had said this, made reference to this speech that Moshe Dayan said, and he asked, why is it that no one asked why we shouldn't be afraid? Why shouldn't we be afraid? We have very strong enemies who outnumber us enormously, not only in the numbers of soldiers, but also in artillery and in arms. They are much, much stronger than us. Why shouldn't we be afraid? It's very nice to tell people not to be afraid, but if we don't have something of substance upon which this inspiration is based on, then really it's hot air inspiration. How can one be inspired? And in fact, we know a very well-known quote from Ben Gurion: in Israel, in order to be a realist, you must believe in miracles. That's what Ben Gurion said, who was not a religious Jew, but he made this statement. And this is the message that the Rebbe really conveyed, that if you look in this week's Torah portion of Shoftim, which is in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 20, verse 1, we have a very important verse out of which comes numerous points from this one single verse, which we must never forget if we want to, in fact, truly be able to empower ourselves to go into war with confidence and without fear. And this is what the verse says. It says, Kiseisi la'malchama alaivecha, when you will go out to a war on your enemy, V're'isa sus v'rechev am rav mimcha, and you will see a horse in a chariot which is much greater than you. Lo sira mehem, do not fear them. Ki Hashem lekecha imach, because God, your God, is with you. Hamalcha me'eretz Mitzrayim, who raised you up from the land of Egypt. Now there are a few very important points over here. The first point is, when Rashi makes the first 3 points I'm going to make, that when the verse says, when you'll go out to war on your enemy, Rashi says that you should not have mercy upon them, because they will not have mercy upon you. That we need to realize that there is appropriate mercy, which is in the vast majority of situations we find ourselves in, and then there is inappropriate mercy. Not only is it inappropriate, but when mercy is misplaced, as Rashi says earlier in this week's Torah portion, then what will end up happening is, if you misplace mercy, where you're supposed to be strong and not have mercy, then that is going to backfire and end up hurting you. So when you're nice, when you should be strong, then the people you're being nice to will be strong against you. That's the first thing that we need to realize. This is one of the greatest challenges that we're dealing with right now, the ability to actually sustain our strength. And we're seeing cracks within Israel now because of understandable vulnerabilities of the desire to save some lives. But we always have to factor in how many the enormous losses we may have long term if we have a premature ceasefire take place. The verse continues by saying that when you will see the enemy, sus v'rechev, a horse and a chariot. Now what's interesting, Rashi points out, is that the verse says, it doesn't say horses, which would be susim. It says sus, a horse, you will see a horse. So Rashi makes a point of saying that God is saying, in my eyes, the entire army, all of their horses, to me are like one horse and one chariot. So you should know when you're going out to war that God is with you, and this is the critical point of not having fear, to know that I am with God, God is with me. God is present with me, and to God, 1,000 horses and one horse is the same. 1,000,000 tanks and one tank is all the same to God. We saw this actually play itself out very explicitly and clearly during the 6-day war. And we have other verses in the Torah Rashi brings down where refers to where we can see again that the Torah refers to the enemy in singular, to say that before God they're all just like one. And then the verse says that they are a nation, Rav Mimcha, which is greater than you. So Rashi quotes that when it says a nation greater than you, Rashi, the word mimcha can mean than you or can mean from you. That the only reason why any nation in the world will feel stronger than the Jewish people is because in our eyes they are an Amrav, a great nation. Not in reality, not from the perspective of God, but that's only from our human perspective, that when we measure things by numbers and by physical might. So God reminds us that the only reason why our enemy will look more powerful is because of a mistaken perspective that we actually have. And then the last part of the verse is, God says, I raised you up out of Egypt. And what this verse is telling us, as the Rebbe explains, is that most often in the Torah, when God refers to taking the Jews out of Egypt, He uses the language of Hamoitziacha, who took you out of Egypt. Where here God says Hamalcha, who raised you up from Egypt. And what God is trying to convey in this verse is that it is imperative on every single Jew, that every single one of us, you and I, raise ourselves up so that we don't have a perspective, which is a perspective that is created by the eyes of flesh. But we have a perspective which comes from the eyes of our soul, there is a perspective of faith, of knowing that God is with us. And from God's perspective, 1,000 tanks is like one tank, 10,000 planes is like one plane. God can obliterate them all in a single moment. And when we have this faith, as the Rebbe conveyed, then we have nothing to fear. So we're someone to ask, why shouldn't we fear? That's a very good question. And the answer is one simple answer. Because God is with his beloved people. And the more we are aware in our conscious state of mind that God is with us, which automatically expresses itself in our emotional state, where we are no longer in a high state of fear, but in a state of confidence, that is what invites the presence of God to be with us in a more manifest way. And this is an idea that the Rebbe expressed repeatedly, that every single Jew around the world can actually support by being another individual whose faith in God is concrete. And the simple way to do this, simple but not easy, but simple way to do this is to ask ourselves, do I really have faith in God? If I really do have faith in God, is there anywhere in my life that I am doing something which demonstrates a lack of faith, such as God commanding me as a Jew to do a certain thing, and I'm not taking out the time to do it because I'm busy doing other things which I feel are more important, which would be a demonstration of a lack of faith? What is one thing I can do where I will do it solely on the faith that God says such and such, and therefore I will do it, even though my eyes of flesh may say, really, how can that be? And then I become a more faithful Jew. When I become a more faithful Jew, the Jewish people have become a more faithful people. And if every single Jew around the world does this, we will have the power that God makes available to us, and we will witness before our own eyes that in fact our enemies are just like one simple soldier standing there, which is not a threat at all. We can eliminate very, very easily.